Marcus Chen had been staring at the same intelligence briefing for 20 minutes, but his mind kept wandering to the coffee stain on page 3 that looked remarkably like a map of his hometown. The fluorescent lights in conference room B hummed with the kind of persistence that made you forget what silence sounded like. Around the rectangular table, 8 other members of the Metropolitan SWAT unit shifted in their chairs, waiting for Captain Rodriguez to finish whatever urgent phone call had pulled him away from their morning briefing. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. Prince Alexander of Valdonia was making his first official visit to the United States, and their unit had been selected to provide additional security support for the State Department's protection detail. It was the kind of high-profile assignment that looked impressive on performance reviews and usually involved a lot of standing around looking intimidating while diplomats shook hands and smiled for cameras. Marcus had been with the SWAT team for 6 years, ever since his discharge from the Army Rangers. At 32, he was old enough to have seen real combat in Afghanistan but young enough that his reflexes hadn't started betraying him yet. His teammates respected his tactical experience, and his supervisors appreciated that he never complained about overtime or questioned orders. He was exactly the kind of operator you wanted watching your back when things went sideways. Captain Rodriguez finally returned, sliding his phone into his pocket with the kind of gesture that suggested the call hadn't gone well. He was a compact man in his late 40s, with gray threading through his black hair and the kind of weathered face that came from 20 years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. Despite his serious expression, there was something almost fatherly about the way he looked after his team. "Sorry about that," Rodriguez said, taking his seat at the head of the table. "Where were we?" "Prince Alexander," offered Sarah Kim, the team's communications specialist. She had an uncanny ability to remember exactly where any conversation had left off, which made her invaluable during complex operations. "Valdonia. First official state visit." "Right." Rodriguez flipped through his own copy of the briefing materials. "Here's what we know. Prince Alexander is 28 years old, second in line for the Valdonian throne. He's here for a week-long diplomatic tour focusing on trade agreements and cultural exchange programs. The visit includes stops at the White House, the United Nations, and several universities." Marcus glanced at the photograph clipped to his briefing packet. Prince Alexander looked younger than his 28 years, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested a lifetime of public scrutiny. His dark hair was perfectly styled, and his blue eyes held the confident expression of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "The Valdonian security detail consists of 6 royal guards," Rodriguez continued. "They're trained by the same people who train Britain's Royal Protection Service, so we're not dealing with ceremonial soldiers in fancy uniforms. These guys are legitimate operators." Detective Lisa Park, who served as their intelligence analyst, raised her hand. "What's the threat assessment looking like?" Rodriguez's expression darkened slightly. "That's where things get interesting. 3 weeks ago, Valdonian intelligence intercepted communications suggesting that a domestic terrorist group might be planning something during the prince's visit. Nothing concrete, but enough to make everyone nervous." The room fell silent except for the humming lights and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded dangerous assignments. It wasn't fear exactly, but rather the physiological preparation that his body had learned during his military service. His heart rate slowed, his breathing deepened, and his awareness sharpened. "What kind of domestic group?" asked Tony Reeves, their explosives specialist. Tony had the build of a linebacker and the disposition of a golden retriever, but his expertise with improvised devices had saved countless lives over the years. "That's classified above our pay grade," Rodriguez replied. "What we know is that State Department security requested additional tactical support, and we drew the short straw." Marcus studied the operational timeline included in his packet. The prince would arrive on Monday morning and spend 3 days in the city before moving on to Washington. Their primary responsibility would be providing perimeter security and rapid response capability during the prince's public appearances. The Valdonian guards will be handling close protection, Rodriguez explained. We'll be maintaining outer security cordons and responding to any situations that exceed their capabilities. Think of it as a backup to their backup. Officer Janet Walsh, their sniper specialist, looked up from her notes. Rules of engagement. Standard diplomatic protection protocols. De-escalation first, minimum necessary force, and absolutely no international incidents. Rodriguez's tone made it clear that the last point wasn't negotiable. This is a goodwill visit between allied nations. Our job is to make sure it stays that way. The briefing continued for another hour, covering everything from traffic patterns to emergency medical protocols. Marcus found himself paying particular attention to the sections dealing with interagency coordination. Experience had taught him that the most dangerous situations often resulted from miscommunication between different security teams rather than external threats. After the meeting, Marcus lingered in the conference room, studying the layout diagrams of the various locations they would be securing. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the prince would be attending a cultural exhibition, presented particular challenges due to its size and the number of public access points. The university campus where he would be delivering a lecture was even more complex, with multiple buildings and thousands of potential civilians in the area. Sarah Kim appeared at his shoulder, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the break room machine. She handed him one without being asked, which was typical of her thoughtful nature. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling into the chair next to his. Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully. Just trying to get a feel for the operational environment. Something about this whole thing feels off. Off how? He struggled to articulate the unease that had been building since the briefing began. Think about it. If there's a credible terrorist threat against a visiting head of state, why are they maintaining such a public schedule? And why request tactical support from local law enforcement instead of bringing in federal assets? Sarah considered this, sipping her coffee thoughtfully. Maybe they want to avoid the appearance of taking the threat too seriously. Bad optics if word gets out that they're treating a cultural exchange visit like a military operation. Maybe, Marcus agreed, but he wasn't entirely convinced. His experience had taught him that when security protocols didn't make complete sense, there was usually information being withheld. The question was whether that information was being withheld for legitimate operational security reasons or because someone was trying to manage a situation they didn't fully understand. His phone buzzed with a text message from his ex-wife, reminding him that he was supposed to pick up his daughter Emma for dinner on Thursday. The timing would depend on how the security operation played out, but he made a mental note to confirm the arrangement. Emma was 8 years old and had inherited her mother's talent for making him feel guilty when work interfered with their time together. The rest of the week passed in a blur of preparation activities. The team conducted site surveys of all the locations on the prince's itinerary, coordinated with federal security agencies, and ran through various tactical scenarios in their training facility. Marcus found himself impressed by the professionalism of the advance team from the State Department, who seemed to have anticipated most of the challenges they identified. On Friday afternoon, they received an updated threat assessment that elevated the overall risk level from moderate to high. The change was attributed to additional intelligence suggesting that the potential attack might involve multiple perpetrators and could target the prince's security detail as well as the prince himself. Captain Rodriguez called an emergency briefing to discuss the new information. The mood in Conference Room B was noticeably more tense than it had been earlier in the week. "The good news is that we're not changing the overall security plan," Rodriguez announced. "The bad news is that everyone needs to be prepared for the possibility that this isn't just a ceremonial assignment." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. High-threat dignitary protection was always a delicate balance between providing adequate security and maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Too little security and you risked an actual attack. Too much security and you created the impression that the threat was more serious than officials were willing to admit publicly. "Are we getting any additional resources?" asked Tony Reeves. "2 more sniper teams and a tactical response unit will be on standby," Rodriguez replied. Plus the FBI is providing additional intelligence support. But, remember, this is still officially a routine diplomatic visit. After the briefing, Marcus drove home to his apartment in Queens, a modest one-bedroom place that reflected his practical approach to life. He had moved there after his divorce, choosing location and affordability over style or space. The building was solid and secure, and the commute to work was manageable even in heavy traffic. He spent the evening reviewing his tactical gear and mentally rehearsing various scenarios that might develop during the operation. His service weapon was a Glock 22, supplemented by a tactical knife and various non-lethal options. His body armor was rated for rifle rounds, and his communications equipment would keep him in contact with both his team and the Federal Coordination Center. As he prepared for bed, Marcus found himself thinking about a conversation he had had with his Army Ranger instructor years earlier. The man had been a grizzled veteran of multiple deployments who had a talent for distilling complex tactical concepts into simple truths. The most dangerous situations, the instructor had said, are the ones where you think you understand what's happening, but you're actually missing a crucial piece of information. Stay alert, trust your instincts, and remember that the enemy gets a vote in how things play out. At the time, Marcus had assumed the advice applied primarily to combat operations in hostile territory. Now, as he lay in bed listening to the sounds of traffic and sirens from the street below, he wondered if it might be equally relevant to protecting a foreign prince in the middle of New York City. Sunday evening, Marcus received a final briefing via secure email. Prince Alexander would be arriving Monday morning at LaGuardia Airport, where he would be met by a reception committee including the Deputy Secretary of State and the Valdonian ambassador. From there, the motorcade would proceed to the Waldorf Astoria, where the prince would be staying for the duration of his visit. The first public appearance would be Tuesday morning at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, followed by a working lunch with business leaders and an evening reception at the Valdonian Consulate. Wednesday would involve the university lecture and a private meeting with the mayor, while Thursday would focus on visits to cultural institutions before the departure for Washington. It was an ambitious schedule that would require precise coordination between multiple security agencies and constant vigilance against potential threats. Marcus reviewed the timeline one more time, noting the critical transition points where the prince would be most vulnerable. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Marcus found himself hoping that his uneasy Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made New York City look like a postcard. Marcus arrived at the staging area near LaGuardia Airport at 5:30, 2 hours before Prince Alexander's scheduled arrival. The coordination center had been established in a temporary command trailer, where representatives from the State Department, FBI, NYPD, and Valdonian security were finalizing last-minute arrangements. The atmosphere was professional but tense, with the kind of focused energy that Marcus recognized from his military service. Everyone understood that the next few days would require flawless execution, and the margin for error was essentially zero. Captain Rodriguez gathered the SWAT team around a tactical map displayed on a large monitor. "The prince's flight is on schedule," he announced. "Weather is clear, no reported traffic issues, and no changes to the security plan. Everyone knows their assignments." Marcus would be positioned at the airport perimeter, providing overwatch as the motorcade formed up for the trip into the city. Sarah Kim would be monitoring communications from the command vehicle, while Tony Reeves and the rest of the team would be distributed along the route to provide rapid response capability. At 7:15, Marcus received word through his earpiece that the prince's aircraft was beginning its final approach. He adjusted his position on the terminal roof, using his binoculars to scan the surrounding area for any signs of unusual activity. The morning rush hour traffic was building, but everything appeared normal. The aircraft touched down smoothly and taxied to the designated area where the reception committee was waiting. Marcus watched through his scope as the aircraft door opened and the Valdonian advance team emerged first, followed by 6 men in dark suits who moved with the kind of disciplined precision that marked them as the Royal Guards Captain Rodriguez had mentioned. Prince Alexander appeared in the doorway a moment later, and Marcus got his first real look at the man they would be protecting for the next 4 days. The prince was taller than his photographs suggested, with the kind of confident bearing that came from a lifetime of public appearances. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit and moved down the aircraft stairs with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to being watched. The reception ceremony proceeded exactly as planned, with brief remarks from the Deputy Secretary of State and a traditional welcome from the Valdonian ambassador. Marcus noted that the royal guards maintained a loose but clearly defined perimeter around the prince, positioning themselves to provide rapid response capability while remaining unobtrusive enough to avoid interfering with the diplomatic protocol. The lead guard was a man in his early 30s with short blonde hair and the kind of alert expression that suggested extensive tactical training. His name, according to the briefing materials, was Captain Erich Volkov, and he had been responsible for the prince's security for the past 3 years. As the motorcade formed up for the trip into the city, Marcus caught his first glimpse of potential friction between the American and Valdonian security teams. Captain Volkov approached the senior State Department agent with what appeared to be a question about vehicle positioning, but the conversation quickly became animated. Through his earpiece, Marcus heard Sarah Kim's voice providing a running commentary on the exchange. "Looks like there's some disagreement about motorcade configuration," she reported. "The Valdonian team wants their vehicles positioned differently than what we planned." Captain Rodriguez's voice came through the communications channel a moment later. "All units, maintain positions and stand by. Command is working through some last-minute coordination issues." Marcus watched as the discussion continued for several more minutes before both sides appeared to reach some kind of compromise. The vehicles were rearranged slightly, with the Valdonian security car moving closer to the prince's limousine. The motorcade finally departed the airport at 8:45, 15 minutes behind schedule. Marcus gathered his equipment and headed for his assigned vehicle, which would shadow the main convoy at a distance of approximately half a mile. The trip into Manhattan proceeded without incident, though Marcus noticed that traffic seemed heavier than normal for a Monday morning. The FBI had arranged for subtle traffic management to ease the motorcade's progress, but they were trying to avoid the kind of obvious street closures that would attract public attention. As they approached the Waldorf Astoria, Marcus found himself studying the crowds of pedestrians on the sidewalks. Most people seemed oblivious to the fact that a foreign prince was passing by, but he noted several individuals who appeared to be watching the convoy with more interest than casual curiosity would explain. The arrival at the hotel went smoothly, with the prince being escorted inside through a secure entrance while his luggage was handled by a combination of hotel staff and security personnel. Marcus took up a position across the street, where he would maintain surveillance for the next 4 hours until the evening shift took over. The morning passed quietly, with normal pedestrian and vehicle traffic around the hotel. Marcus found himself getting to know the rhythm of the neighborhood, noting the regular patterns of delivery trucks, taxi traffic, and foot traffic that characterized this part of Manhattan. Around noon, he noticed a change in the activity level around the hotel's main entrance. Several additional security personnel had appeared, and there seemed to be more coordination between the various agencies responsible for the prince's protection. Sarah Kim's voice crackled through his earpiece. "All units, be advised that we have received updated intelligence regarding potential threats. Maintain heightened awareness and report any unusual activity immediately." Marcus felt his pulse quicken slightly. Updated threat intelligence during an active protection operation was never a good sign, particularly when the details weren't being shared with the tactical teams. He spent the next hour conducting a more intensive surveillance of his assigned sector, paying particular attention to any individuals or vehicles that appeared multiple times or seemed to be conducting their own surveillance of the hotel. By 2 o'clock, he had identified 3 separate individuals who merited closer observation, though none of them exhibited behavior that would justify immediate intervention. The afternoon shift change proceeded normally, with Marcus briefing his replacement on the individuals he had been watching and the general security situation around the hotel. He was scheduled for a 4-hour break before returning for the evening shift that would cover the prince's attendance at a private dinner. Instead of going home, Marcus decided to grab lunch at a diner near the command center where he could stay current on any developments in the security situation. The place was filled with off-duty police officers and federal agents, creating an atmosphere of professional camaraderie mixed with underlying tension. He was finishing his sandwich when Detective Lisa Parks slid into the booth across from him. She looked tired, which was unusual for someone who typically maintained an almost supernatural level of energy. "Rough morning?" Marcus asked. Lisa shrugged, signaling the waitress for coffee. "Just trying to make sense of some intelligence reports that don't quite add up. Anything I should know about?" She glanced around the diner before leaning forward slightly. "Remember how the original threat assessment mentioned a domestic terrorist group? Well, it turns out that group might not actually exist." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "What do you mean?" "I mean that when the FBI tried to verify the intelligence that came from Valdonian sources, they couldn't find any corroborating evidence. No communications intercepts, no financial transactions, no surveillance footage. Nothing. So either the Valdonians have access to intelligence sources we don't know about, or someone is feeding them false information," Lisa finished. "The question is whether they know it's false." This was exactly the kind of missing puzzle piece that Marcus had been worried about since the initial briefing. If the threat assessment was based on questionable intelligence, then, they might be preparing for the wrong kind of incident entirely. "Has anyone talked to the Valdonian security team about this?" he asked. "That's above my pay grade," Lisa replied. "But, I get the impression that there are some very tense conversations happening in rooms we're not invited to." Marcus finished his lunch in thoughtful silence, considering the implications of what Lisa had told him. If the Valdonian security team believed they were facing a legitimate terrorist threat, they would be operating under a completely different set of assumptions than the American teams, who were increasingly skeptical about the intelligence. That kind of disconnect between Allied security forces was a recipe for exactly the sort of misunderstanding that could turn a routine protection assignment into an international incident. He returned to his apartment for a few hours of rest before the evening shift, but found it impossible to sleep. Instead, he spent the time reviewing everything he knew about the operation and trying to identify potential points of failure. The evening shift began at 6 o'clock, with Marcus taking up a position near the Valdonian consulate where the prince would be attending a reception for prominent members of the Valdonian American business community. The event was scheduled to last 3 hours, with approximately 200 guests in attendance. The security setup was more complex than the hotel surveillance, involving multiple perimeters and coordination between building security, consulate guards, and the various American agencies. Marcus was positioned with Tony Reeves on a rooftop across the street, providing overwatch for the main entrance and surrounding streets. At 7:30, the prince's motorcade arrived at the consulate. Marcus watched through his binoculars as Captain Volkov and his team conducted their standard protective procedures, escorting the prince from his vehicle to the building entrance with the kind of smooth efficiency that demonstrated extensive training and experience. The first 2 hours of the reception proceeded without incident. Marcus observed the normal flow of guests arriving and departing, along with the routine activities of pedestrians and traffic in the surrounding area. At 9:45, everything changed. Marcus was conducting a routine scan of the street below when he noticed a man in a dark jacket who appeared to be watching the consulate entrance with unusual intensity. The individual was positioned near a bus stop approximately half a block from the building, but he hadn't boarded either of the 2 buses that had stopped during the time Marcus had been observing him. "Tony, you seeing the guy at the bus stop?" Marcus asked his partner. Tony adjusted his own binoculars. "Yeah, I've got him. He's been there for at least 20 minutes without getting on a bus." Marcus keyed his radio. "Command, this is Overwatch 1. We have a possible surveillance subject at the bus stop on 5th Street. Individual appears to be conducting extended observation of the target location." Sarah Kim's voice responded immediately. "Copy, Overwatch 1. Can you provide a description?" "Male, approximately 30 years old, dark jacket, jeans, brown hair. He's holding what appears to be a cell phone but hasn't been using it for communication." For the next several minutes, Marcus continued monitoring the suspect while additional security personnel moved into position to provide closer observation. The man remained at the bus stop, occasionally checking his phone but maintaining visual contact with the consulate entrance. At 10:05, the situation escalated. The suspect suddenly started walking rapidly toward the consulate, reaching into his jacket as he moved. Marcus felt his training kick in as he tracked the individual through his scope, ready to engage if the man produced a weapon. "Command, suspect is moving toward the target location and, reaching into his jacket," Marcus reported, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surge he was experiencing. Before anyone could respond, Captain Volkov and 2 other royal guards emerged from the consulate, apparently conducting a routine security sweep of the perimeter. The timing couldn't have been worse. The suspect, apparently startled by the appearance of the guards, broke into a run directly toward the building entrance. One of the royal guards, a tall man with dark hair, immediately moved to intercept him. What happened next would later be described in 17 different ways by the various witnesses and security personnel who observed it. From Marcus's perspective on the rooftop, he saw the suspect and the royal guard collide near the consulate entrance. Both men went down, and, in the confusion that followed, it was impossible to tell who was the aggressor and who was defending themselves. Additional security personnel converged on the scene from multiple directions, creating a chaotic situation where it became difficult to distinguish between threats and responders. Marcus kept his scope trained on the area, looking for any indication that the suspect was armed or that additional threats were present. Then, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A second individual, previously unnoticed, was approaching the crowd of security personnel from behind. This person was clearly reaching for something concealed beneath his jacket, and his movement pattern suggested hostile intent. "Command, we have a second suspect approaching from the west. He appears to be armed," Marcus transmitted, shifting his aim to cover the new threat. The second suspect had almost reached the crowd when one of the American security agents spotted him and shouted a warning. The suspect responded by producing what appeared to be a weapon, though from Marcus's distance and angle, he couldn't clearly identify what type. Captain Volkov, still struggling with the first suspect on the ground, looked up at the warning shout just as the second suspect raised his weapon. The royal guard immediately released his hold on the first man and reached for his own sidearm. Marcus found himself faced with a split-second decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through his scope, he could see that Captain Volkov was about to be caught in a crossfire between the 2 suspects, with insufficient cover to protect himself. The American security agents were too far away to intervene effectively, and the other royal guards were positioned on the wrong side of the crowd. Everything seemed to slow down as Marcus's training took over. He had a clear shot at the second suspect, but taking it would mean firing into a crowd of security personnel and potentially hitting innocent bystanders. However, failing to act would likely result in Captain Volkov's death and possibly the deaths of other security personnel. Marcus made his choice. The rifle shot echoed off the surrounding buildings as Marcus engaged the second suspect, who collapsed immediately. The sound of gunfire caused the crowd of security personnel to scatter, revealing the first suspect attempting to flee the scene. In the chaos that followed, Marcus lost sight of Captain Volkov and couldn't immediately determine whether the royal guard had been injured in the exchange. Additional law enforcement units were converging on the scene, and the wail of sirens filled the air. "Overwatch 1, report," came Sarah Kim's urgent voice through the radio. Marcus was still scanning the scene through his scope, looking for any additional threats and trying to assess the situation on the ground. One suspect down, second suspect fled on foot heading north on 5th Street. Cannot confirm status of friendly personnel at this time. As he watched, paramedics arrived and began treating the wounded suspect, while other security personnel established a wider perimeter around the consulate. The prince's motorcade was rapidly formed up, and, within minutes, he was being evacuated from the building under heavy guard. It wasn't until much later that Marcus learned the full implications of what had happened in those chaotic few minutes outside the Valdonian consulate. The first suspect turned out to be an investigative journalist who had been researching financial connections between Valdonian business interests and American political figures. The second suspect, whom Marcus had shot, was actually an undercover FBI agent who had been part of the surveillance team monitoring the journalist. Captain Volkov, in the process of detaining the journalist, had been unaware that federal agents were operating in the area. The FBI agent, seeing what he believed was an assault on a civilian by foreign security personnel, had attempted to intervene. Marcus's shot, intended to save the life of a royal guard, had instead seriously wounded a federal law enforcement officer and created exactly the kind of international incident that everyone had been trying to avoid. Within hours, the story was dominating news cycles around the world, with headlines describing a SWAT sniper's attack on federal agents during a diplomatic reception. The Valdonian government immediately characterized the incident as an unprovoked assault on their security personnel, while American officials struggled to explain how their own agencies had ended up in a confrontation with each other. As Marcus sat in a debriefing room at federal headquarters, waiting to give his account of the incident, he couldn't escape the feeling that he had been manipulated into a situation where any decision he made would have catastrophic consequences. The question that kept running through his mind was whether the entire operation had been designed to create exactly this kind of crisis, and, if so, who was pulling the strings. The debriefing room at federal headquarters smelled like stale coffee and industrial disinfectant, with the kind of harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look tired and guilty. Marcus had been sitting at the metal table for 3 hours, going through his account of the incident for the 4th time with investigators from the FBI, State Department, and Internal Affairs. Special Agent Rebecca Torres, the lead investigator, was a woman in her early 40s with prematurely gray hair and the kind of penetrating stare that suggested she had heard every possible lie that suspects could invent. She had been asking the same questions in different ways, looking for inconsistencies in Marcus's story that might suggest he was hiding something. "Let's go through the timeline again," Agent Torres said, consulting her notes. "At what point did you first observe the second suspect?" Marcus rubbed his temples, fighting off the headache that had been building since the incident. "At approximately 21:55 hours, I noticed an individual approaching the crowd from the west. His movement pattern and body language suggested hostile intent." "And you made the decision to engage based on what specific threat indicators?" "The subject appeared to be drawing a weapon while approaching from behind a group of security personnel who were focused on the first suspect. Captain Volkov was in a vulnerable position and would not have been aware of the approaching threat." Agent Torres made a note in her file. "Did you attempt to communicate with the suspect before engaging?" "There was insufficient time. The distance between the suspect and the potential victims was approximately 15 meters, and he was moving rapidly." This was the crucial point that Marcus knew would determine whether he faced criminal charges or departmental discipline. Use of deadly force was justified only when there was an imminent threat to life, but proving that threshold had been met required demonstrating that no other reasonable options existed. The problem was that the suspect he had shot turned out to be FBI agent David Martinez, a 12-year veteran who had been conducting surveillance on the journalist as part of an ongoing investigation into potential foreign influence operations. Agent Martinez was currently in intensive care with a gunshot wound to the shoulder that had narrowly missed major blood vessels. The door to the debriefing room opened, and Captain Rodriguez entered with a man Marcus didn't recognize. The stranger was tall and thin, with silver hair and the kind of expensive suit that suggested significant authority. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. "Agent Torres, I need to speak with Officer Chen privately," the man said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to having his requests treated as orders. Agent Torres looked like she wanted to object, but something about the stranger's credentials caused her to gather her files and leave the room without argument. Captain Rodriguez followed her out, leaving Marcus alone with the mysterious official. "Officer Chen, my name is Colonel James Harrison. I work for the Defense Intelligence Agency." The man took the seat that Agent Torres had vacated, placing a slim briefcase on the table between them. "We need to discuss some aspects of last night's incident that aren't being covered in the official investigation." Marcus felt a chill of apprehension. The Defense Intelligence Agency handled military intelligence operations, and their involvement suggested that the situation was more complex than it appeared. "I've told the investigators everything I know about what happened," Marcus said carefully. Colonel Harrison opened his briefcase and extracted a tablet computer, which he activated with a fingerprint scan. "Officer Chen, what I'm about to show you is classified at the highest levels. You need to understand that discussing this information with unauthorized personnel would constitute a serious federal crime." The tablet screen displayed what appeared to be a satellite image of the area around the Valdonian consulate, with various annotations and time stamps. Marcus could see the positions of security personnel, civilians, and vehicles in the minutes leading up to the incident. This imagery was captured by a military surveillance satellite that happened to be passing overhead during the incident, Colonel Harrison explained. What it shows contradicts several key aspects of the official narrative. Marcus studied the image, noting the positions of the various individuals involved in the confrontation. "What am I supposed to be seeing?" Colonel Harrison touched the screen, zooming in on a particular section of the image. "Look at the timestamp on this frame. It was taken 30 seconds before you fired your shot." The enhanced image showed the second suspect, later identified as FBI Agent Martinez, approaching the crowd of security personnel. But, from this angle, it was clear that Agent Martinez had his badge and identification clearly visible in his left hand, while his right hand was reaching not for a weapon but for his radio. Agent Martinez was attempting to identify himself as a federal officer when you engaged him, Colonel Harrison continued. The satellite imagery shows that he never drew a weapon and never posed a threat to Captain Volkov or anyone else. Marcus felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. If this was accurate, then, he had shot an unarmed federal agent who was trying to help resolve the situation. Why wasn't this shown to the other investigators? Marcus asked. Because the existence of this surveillance capability is classified, Colonel Harrison replied. And, because there are aspects of this operation that go beyond a simple misunderstanding between security agencies. The colonel touched the tablet again, bringing up a new image that showed the broader area around the consulate. This view revealed something that Marcus hadn't been aware of during the incident: additional personnel positioned at strategic locations around the building, clearly coordinating their activities through some kind of communications network. Officer Chen, you and your team were not the only surveillance assets operating in that area last night. What you witnessed was the intersection of at least 3 separate intelligence operations, none of which were fully coordinated with the others. Marcus studied the satellite image, identifying what appeared to be at least 6 additional surveillance teams positioned around the consulate. Who were they working for? That's where things get complicated, Colonel Harrison said. Some were ours, some were theirs, and some were working for parties whose interests may not align with either of ours. The colonel brought up a third image, this one showing the timeline of communications intercepts from the hour preceding the incident. Marcus could see a complex pattern of messages and signals passing between various parties, suggesting a level of coordination that went far beyond what he had been briefed about. The journalist who was initially detained, Michael Brennan, wasn't conducting routine investigative research, Colonel Harrison explained. He was following up on information provided by a source within the Valdonian government who was concerned about certain financial arrangements between his country and various American interests. Marcus was beginning to understand that he had been caught in the middle of something much larger than a diplomatic protection assignment. What kind of financial arrangements? In the heart of a bustling capital city, where ancient traditions collide with modern security protocols, a single moment of chaos would shatter diplomatic relations between 2 nations and expose a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. What started as a routine protection detail for visiting royalty would end with gunshots, international headlines, and a colonel's desperate attempt to cover up a truth that could topple governments. The surveillance footage would later show exactly 17 seconds of violence that changed everything. 17 seconds that turned a decorated SWAT operative into a fugitive, a royal guard into a victim, and a simple misunderstanding into what one military colonel would frantically declare a sovereign incident, a classification that didn't officially exist but would become the center of a cover-up involving 3 intelligence agencies, 2 governments, and 1 terrible secret. But, the real story began 3 weeks earlier, in a small briefing room where nobody suspected that protecting a prince would lead to the biggest security breach in modern diplomatic history. About the operation was simply pre-mission nerves rather than an indication that they were walking into a situation none of them fully understood.